said that's all is needed. And then just talk about how the things work, instead of going into any details whatsoever. Just what do you use the bucket request for? How does how does the user go from bucket request to actual bucket to how does he use it? Done. At the end of that, it should be it'll be a very small cap at that point. There won't be like 1,000 lines, and you know at that point it'll be a much cleaner discussion in terms of what the issues are, what are they're not. And like Ben is saying, first we'll have the discussion amongst ourselves, try to see if there's a better model for brownfield versus greenfield. And if we either figure out that what we have is the best, or if there's a better model, once we have that answer, I think we can go back to Tim and get things through. um, like I think we
Well,
we
the thing
might
that
be.
bothers me is that like there's five different things that are like that, where it's like we know that what we have is problematic to somebody, and
Mhm.
we got to fix it. But like I would rather fix one thing and then get the person who had a problem with it to say, yeah, that looks good,
Right.
and go around to all the different things one at a time and get them all addressed, and then come back once no one is complaining about anything and say, okay, now let's get approval. But like I don't want all of that to happen inside of some closed room where like we're not releasing updated specs and docs and implementations and everything, because a lot of the best feedback, and this is my experience from doing a POC driver for Cozy in our hackathon and NetApp, is like we needed to just sit down and just write the code and use the existing sidecars and use the existing CRD definitions and try it to realize like, oh wait, bucket access classes are totally insane and we need to change them. Like
Right.
that wasn't obvious, even being in like a year's worth of these meetings. You just have to do it. And unless we're constantly iterating and giving people opportunities to like use it and try it out, we're never going to get to the real feedback. It's always going to be, just something they notice from reading the doc rather than like actually trying it out. And that's the valuable feedback, I think.
especially when NetApp and other vendors want to expose their special properties of their object store, and we need to make sure that our API will support that in
I mean,
a
we,
flexible
we
way.
really don't want to do anything special. Like, I mean, maybe
Right.
someday, but like,
Well,
it's far more important that like the base thing is
Abstractions are good.
usable and will get acceptance, because no one in NetApp wants to write a cozy driver if there's going to be no users for it, right? There has to be users to make it worth our while. And so the highest priority is to make it something that actual consumers will consume.
How many drivers do we have now? So NetApp has one.
We've
Is
got
there one?
Scality, we've got Minayo. I think Red Hat has Ceph. So we have a few drivers, but they
Mhm.
all just follow what we've prescribed. We need people to give feedback, like Ben's team has Ben has given us. Um, yeah, it was always confusing what we were going to do with the bucket class, in the sense what we were going to do with the policy actions config map, and Monday's discussion was fruitful because we got rid of it. We still have some unanswered questions. At least we can go ahead and answer them. Yeah. So like when we're saying, there are a few things that are still kind of unanswered. We left them off. We said, we'll address them post alpha, but I feel like alpha, to be honest, is an artificial deadline. The reason I say that is because we can proceed forward without, like, alpha turns out to almost be a distraction for us, because we focus on that rather than just focusing on development and moving forward. um, and that forces us to kind of decide on shortcuts and wait on the approval before we move forward. um, I would
Yeah.
rather like design it right, and in order to do that, I think we answer all the questions, and only for questions we simply just can't answer, we leave them for later.
Well,
um,
I agree with that. And I was going to say, like some of the debates we end up having, like how to handle brownfield versus greenfield, really don't matter in terms of like how you would write a driver that much, or how an end user would consume the feature. I mean, they end up being relatively minor details, and like whatever you choose, it's just different YAML that you have to use, but like the workflow remains more or less the same. I feel like we spent a lot of time on some of those discussions because we didn't like the way that the Kubernetes API was going to look, when it ended up not moving us forward. Whereas I think focusing on the downward API that pods will be consuming when you connect a bucket to them, and figuring out some of these questions about access control, the discussion we started having on Monday. Like
Right.
those are going to be far more important and useful than arguing about greenfield and brownfield and precisely how we represent it at the Kubernetes level, because we could get a fully implemented design and then Tim could say, I hate your brownfield implementation, do it like this. And we could say, okay,
Yeah.
just do it. And it probably wouldn't change much. Whereas like if you change the way that the downward interface is going to appear to pods, like that's going to ripple through everything in the design, because it's far more impactful and central to what we're actually doing.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes. All right, so let's actually answer that specific question. What are we going to give down to the downward API? And in terms of plan, Xing and Ben, I think rather than focusing, so we will go alpha. We're all aligned with going alpha. But rather than specifically focusing on getting it through alpha, I think Tim would also understand this. How about we focus on fixing the problems that are there in the KEP right now, and then once we fix them, we reach out to Tim. I'm pretty sure it'll be very likely way before any deadline for version 123. So it'll be like in the middle of the the review cycle. I think that would be good, right?
Well, if you really want to get your cap merged, then approved by Tim, I would suggest you approach him early rather than wait until we
But
are done like several iterations, and then we're getting to 1.23 deadline again. So I
Agree.
I would suggest you, if you can get your cap merged before 1.23 even started, that would be
Yeah,
should
that's
go.
what I mean. Yeah.
But otherwise, I think this is like forever.
Yeah. No, we can't let that keep going forever. You're right.
But Tim is critical resource and hard to get as a time. And Sid was really good at pinging Tim politely and respectfully and wanting time. And it came very late in the request cycle. Can we
Yeah.
I'm just asking this for if there's precedence, can we go ahead and get into a release of V1 as V1 alpha 1, 2, 3 without Tim's approval?
No, we cannot, right? That we already discussed that.
Okay,
we need his we need the Tim's approval, the API approval.
Okay, and we can't, and Ben, then to address your idea of iterating through this, we can't even start. We're not going to get very much adoption without it being a V1 alpha, at least, right?
Well, so I'm confused about this. Why? I mean, we already have a bunch of repos with like sidecars in them and YAML definitions and controllers, and they're already being built and they're already being pushed to key.io. Like, what do you mean by we can't do an alpha release? If like,
yeah,
we cannot do
we need to get an API. We need to get API approval.
Right, yeah, we need to get API approval, but like, what can't we do before then? What exactly
we cannot,
can't we do?
No, actually, we cannot really push it up to that official repo right now, because
GCR.kates.io or kates.gcr.io. Right. But
the quit, we can do the quit. We can push it to quit.
So we
but we are already doing that. I mean, I don't think we started doing that a long time ago, right? So that's why we already have a repo. We already have development going on.
We do.
Yeah, and what I'm arguing for is like we just keep doing that and we keep pushing.
Yeah, I'm not saying we don't do that, but I'm just saying in parallel,
we encourage the various.
In parallel, I think this API review. This we need to. I think we need to pin Tim more, get him to review this earlier.
So to answer your question, Jeff, what Xing is saying is we need to get to him as early as possible. I mean, we were pinging Tim for 5 weeks. Don't it's not like we weren't early. But what Xing is saying is we should be like pinging him now, not even 5 weeks before the deadline, right, Xing?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Now, if you address some comments, just to get him to review it, the most important one, of course, right?
Yeah. I think that the one.
I think it's going to take quite some time. Just if you just look at it, like even though I was saying volume snapshot, right? That's like even half of the size, right? And then every time we go from pre-alpha to alpha, from alpha to beta, all went through big API reviews. Takes a long time, right? So this is even a lot more complicated than that.
I think this is not very complicated actually. So
it just have too many pieces. I mean, okay,
Yeah.
this has too many pieces.
I'll tell you, so when I did the cloud provider thing, we had way more pieces, and we had no problems getting it through. The thing is, how we put it across also matters. I think. I mean, I'm not saying.
I don't
the
know about
design is
that because I
complex.
haven't worked
Yeah.
on cloud. I have no idea. But this one, you are introducing like 6 new API objects, right? Just like that. Just the size of that. That's a lot more.
I see.
Because I know it took
Yeah.
forever for one snapshot to get in that. I know, 2 years for the
Oh
whole.
wow.
No, but that's to the GA.
To GA, okay.
But then before that, there was also pre-alpha that I didn't count.
Okay.
That probably has like half a year. I don't know. So
Yeah.
the whole thing takes
Yep.
a very long time. Yeah.
So
But we're in that pre-alpha phase, and the thing I was trying to emphasize is like we can make a lot of progress without wrapping ourselves around the axe. Like I want Tim's feedback. We should ping him and ask him for feedback. But like if he says I don't like this and I don't like this, like it doesn't mean we have to.
But then
address those
you
things
want
right
this project to continue without ever saying released as alpha or beta. I mean,
no, I don't think that's
that-
what he's. So
No,
he's
no,
saying something like.
I'm saying we
so
will
as
get there faster if we iterate rather
I don't
than.
know if we. Well, I'm not saying you stop changing. Whatever you're doing. The downward part. I mean, that part is. I think it's good to have some. So you road driver, you got experience. You know what's right, what's wrong, right? So I think that's good feedback. Definitely, we should continue. I'm not saying what. I don't think that part should be stopped.
Yeah.
Team has a lot of feedback on that part.
Yeah, so let's do this. Let's actually, as we keep making progress, let's keep reaching out to Tim before even going and getting the KEP ready. So let's say we make a decision today about how the downward API will look. Let's ping Tim and tell him, hey, look, this is what we're thinking of for the downward API. And maybe he won't review it right away, but he'll probably get a chance to look at it. And maybe he doesn't even respond right away, but he'll probably read it. So we'll keep him in the loop throughout, rather than bringing him in at the end with a lot of.
I like that.
Okay, let's do that. And Ben, that would address your.
That's what I was suggesting too. Is keep him in the loop, but don't treat him as a gate. Don't be like, well, Tim didn't say yes, so we're stuck.
Agreed.
Just be like, we have a review out to Tim, and we're plowing ahead, until he gets back to us.
Right. I want to set the tone and language for this KEP, and then I'll have others, also update it. But I want to set the tone and language so that it's very concise and clear. That's all I'm trying to do. But today, rather than even focusing on the KEP, I would like to focus on the downward API, because that's what we said we'll talk about.
And we should clarify what we mean, or maybe I should clarify what we mean by that, because it could be confusing. But I'm talking specifically about what the pods, what you see from inside the pod, if you've created a pod that has a bucket attached to it. There's also the question of exactly how the pod API changes in the long run. Like, how exactly do you specify that you want your bucket to be bound to a pod, and what sort of fields become available in the pod? Because there's you can do things like certain fields in the pod become environment variables inside the container where the pod is running. Like those kinds of things might be interesting to define as well. But I really want to focus on what exactly does the stuff that we provide to the pod look like inside the pod, so that we can make sure that we're providing that all the way from the top to the bottom.
Fair enough. Yeah, you're designing the API with the user downward API in mind. You're designing the whole system. I like that, because that's the main thing, really. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give buckets to workloads.
Yes.
Okay, so let's not get into how to specify it in the pod yet, because I think that'll be two different discussions. That one, yeah. So let me just put something here. I'm just using this to write down right now. Whether becomes a section of the KEP or not is a different story. But let's just call this download API, and yeah. So some of the requirements we had for this download API was it has to be a managed API, not just a bunch of fields. Sorry, and that's because you might want to evolve this API. You might want to add new fields, and when you do that, you don't want new client or old clients to fail with the new version of the API. So it has to be a backward compatible managed API, versioned, and all the managed API. I mean, like by managed, I mean versioned and backward compatible and all that good stuff.
Yes, I agree with all that.
Okay. Okay, now let's get into. I'm just setting the tone for like I'm just setting the
Yeah.
requirements for it, but now we can get into.
But I think that the first important decision is like whether to allow like opaque pass-throughs or not. And we might make one decision and revisit it later, but like I'm kind of against. I know at various times we said, well, if vendor X has some extension that allows them to do special thing Y, then what they'll just have some extra fields that in their creds file or whatever the file ends up being called to communicate that extra stuff. And like I'm kind of opposed to allowing opaque things to flow all the way through to the pod because I think it harms portability too much.
so how about can you tell me like in a more specific way, like which field are you thinking of? Like, do you have an example? It'll help me.
Well, so I think we need to enumerate the fields that are like absolutely must have. And those are going to be things like the bucket endpoint, the bucket name,
Mm-hmm.
the access key, the secret,
Yeah.
TLS,
potential, huh?
TLS certificate.
Well, I think that one's debatable because there are a lot of scenarios where it's expected that you just have a TLS certificate already.
Yeah.
If it's like a public cloud, like no one hands you the TLS certificate for the public cloud. It's signed by the regular PKI authorities, and you just trust it.
But in non-public environments, that's not necessarily the case. And you just said you want these things to be portable.
Yeah. So I think that we have to. I'm not saying we ignore it. I'm saying I think that one's a special case where we have to figure out what is the right thing to do. It doesn't feel universal, but it feels like something we can't ignore. So maybe that's like an optional TLS
Yes, sure.
certificate.
Yeah, let's start with the essentials though. Let's start with what are the things that we absolutely need, and then we'll add the stuff that are optional in the sense that are needed for some, not for others. Because that'll help
Right.
us answer this whole opaqueness question, if we know exactly what we want and what may be needed. Because if the things that maybe we need cannot be represented with a typed object, then you need something opaque. But we don't know that yet. So let's start
Well,
with the
and I think it's also important that like whatever we put in here is something that clients will unambiguously know how to interpret.
right.
Because if you put weird stuff in there, then it's like, well, my client knows what to do with that, but another client's like, what is this?
Yeah, don't reinvent any new things. Like that's what you're saying. Don't put in new stuff. Like don't create a new bucket API that has certificates in a weird location instead of like or access key, secret key in a weird way rather than just the usual way.
Yeah. Well, and I think this. So this is one of the. Yeah, we certainly want to use what already exists, if that's what you're saying. I do think that there's, that the minefield here is the different authentication mechanisms. So we've talked about, S3 buckets with access keys and secret keys, sort of being a standard that more or less everyone supports. But then we've also said that there's these weird S3 access modes where like you don't actually have an access key and a secret. What you have is some AWS token from which you could in principle generate an access key and a secret. And like we
Let's
need
not go there
we
now
need to
though.
have a clear statement on whether we want to allow that kind of thing or not.
I think we don't have to, right? Like in a sense, that's not an absolute requirement. Um, I think it's much more reasonable to. I think it's completely reasonable to expect all clients to follow access key secret key model.
Okay, yeah. So if we could make crisp statements like that say, look, we're going to give you an access key and a secret key, and if what you wanted was an AWS token, like you're using the wrong API, like or
Yeah.
you need to invent a new protocol within Cozy that's called something else,
Yeah.
and say that that's not what we're trying to do. So
Right.
so that it can be very clear that everyone who creates a pod and creates a bucket request and binds them in Kubernetes, when the pod comes up, it's going to get that access key and that secret, and he can expect that across the board. And so then he feels comfortable that his development effort is worthwhile because it's portable across Kubernetes clusters. Okay, yeah. So I like the idea. And we're gonna have to be careful about how we define the endpoint, whether it's like an IP address or a host name or a
It's
URL,
FQDN.
because, huh?
It's a FQDN, so it's a fully qualified domain name. It's not an IP address. It's got
Well,
the scheme in it.
there are S3 implementations that don't have domain names; they just have IP addresses.
You still need.
Exactly.
So the thing is, um, IP address is still. You always need the protocol. So it's not just an IP address.
Right.
It's a URL.
Whatever. You
Okay,
need a
so
URL.
it could be a URL with potentially a bare IP address in it or
That's
a
fine.
domain name.
That's
Okay.
fine.
But
Okay.
indeed,
So
we also need to distinguish between HTTP and HTTPS for the S3 case.
Yeah,
yeah.
that's what I mean by protocol. So wait, FQDN doesn't include IP addresses. Does it have to be a name in that case? Then no, just
No,
the
well, the letters FQDN usually refer to a domain name, not an IP address.
got
A
it, got it.
URL
Mm-hmm.
can contain either a domain name or a IP address in it,
Fair enough.
and optionally a port number too. So I was going to
Yeah,
say there are some S3 services that run on non-standard ports, and so being able to
absolutely.
support that would be nice. Um, but we
So,
have to be very clear about whether that's allowed or not. So maybe we should have like the endpoint field is going to be a URL that could be HTTP or HTTPS, might contain domain names or IP addresses or IPv6 addresses, an
Mm-hmm.
optional port number,
Mm-hmm.
and then give a bunch of examples of valid endpoints so that people who are consuming these things know what they might get. Um, and then yeah, then of course we just tell the Cozy driver implementers you gotta supply one of these, and of course it should be obvious how to come up with the URL that represents your endpoint.
Right.
um, okay, so I think that the four essential things are that endpoint, the bucket, name, access key, and secret, right? Like you always need those four things.
um,
Sometimes
wait,
there's a region name. I That's
Yeah.
like that may or may not matter. I've
So
noticed this is one of the squirrely things about AWS is that AWS seems to use region names, but other S3 implementations that are S3 compatible tend to ignore the region name.
actually, even AWS can ignore it. So there is a default region, which is US East 1. If you don't specify a region name, it's assumed that you're talking to US East 1. But now what they've started doing is because S3 bucket names are globally unique across regions, if you hit a bucket, whether you put the region or not, it goes and finds it in a different region if you haven't specified any region. So um, that's actually bad because you might end up paying for cross-region traffic, which is about 10 cents a gigabyte. That adds up very quickly. I think it's okay to every implementation of every object storage system supports the concept of a region. The three that we support the concept of a region. It's up to the driver, it's up to the actual vendor if they want to support it or not, but we should have a region field.
Okay, so you're saying have an optional field that we vend down to the pod for region that if the Cozy driver supports it, it will be supplied, but it's allowed to be blank, in which case it's understood to be unneeded.
No, we always show it. It's just it's up to the driver or the application to ignore if they want to.
No, I'm talking about on the other side. Like if my storage system doesn't have a concept of regions, can I just supply the empty string from my driver
Yeah.
and say region is empty string, and then and require that workloads are able to cope with no region?
well, it shouldn't necessarily be the empty string. Your driver can return
Yeah, that's what
invalid region, And then the application will use that, I mean, it will verbatim use that string as the region, and your storage system may simply ignore it.
Right. Okay. So, but you're saying the empty string is a valid string that you can use and it can be used verbatim and it can get ignored.
I'm
So,
not
Basically,
sure
it
whether the
almost.
empty string is a valid region in SDK implementations for
okay. Well,
S3 clients, but it could be.
well. So these are the kinds of things I'd like to be crisp about. Is like, what exactly, or what are the requirements
No,
on
no,
the
no.
on the provider so that you know what clients can assume.
So
We
there
could
is.
say that the string must not be empty. You have to supply something, and you're free to ignore it, but clients can expect it to be non-empty.
So one thing is we don't have to get into that business at all. Like we can keep things even more crisp. If we said the bucket endpoint is the full URL to the actual bucket, S3 GCS and Azure support path-based bucket access in the sense you can construct a URL, a unique URL to that specific bucket. Um, which encodes the region and the bucket name and everything in it. So ideally, you should only need these three things, nothing more, in order to talk to the bucket. No bucket name, no region.
But that doesn't always work with on-premises storage systems because it requires a wildcard DNS record, which many enterprises don't want to have in their environment. So they stick with the old single endpoint, and then you have to provide bucket name and
You
region in the
can still do
request.
IP addresses. There's no problem with using IP address. You don't need DNS.
Well, but for the S3 protocol, if you have an IP address, you still
That's
need the
correct.
bucket name
Yeah,
and the
yeah. You
endpoint
won't just
name and
give
the
the
region
IP
name.
address. You'll say HTTPS 172.17.0 whatever, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, whatever. And then you'll
But
say
now,
slash whatever bucket one.
but now you don't have the region information.
I'm saying if you look, you don't have to have the region information. The expectation is the bucket endpoint is a unique identifier to the bucket. That's all is needed to actually talk to the backend. See, if you were to use an S3 client, if you were to use an S3 SDK, any S3 SDK, and you wanted to talk to the backend, you need not specifically provide the region as a separate parameter. If the endpoint contains it, it's assumed like it comes from there. That's the first, that's the primary mechanism by which the endpoint is provided to the client. The full URL. You don't need to have a region in here. You don't have to say US East 1 dot something.
Okay, well, so rather than getting wrapped up on this specific thing, I think we need to make some statement about whether there's a field called region or a field that's not called region. If there is, we need to have very specific requirements about what assumptions you can make about it. Like, can it be empty? Do you always get something? And it doesn't matter so much what the details are. You know, we want them to be right, but I'm saying we don't need to argue about it right now. I
So
want to like
do we even need that field is my question. Okay, let's move forward.
maybe not, but like, so we need to come up with the things that are required, and then instead of things that are optional, and specific details about what you can rely on from it, and so that we can implement error checking, right? Like, let's say there is a region ID, let's say it can't be empty, then we would want the Kubernetes sidecar that is filling these things in to throw an error if you supply an empty region, right? We would want to catch those errors early rather than exposing the pod to
Absolutely,
something
absolutely.
that's invalid.
Yeah.
Um, and if we get it wrong, and if we say, you know what, we don't need regions, and then later someone comes back to us and comes with a really convincing case for why you absolutely do
We can
need the
always add
ability
it.
to put a region, then we change the spec and we add it.
Yeah.
Um, I, this is one of the reasons I'm very keen on like putting a stake in the ground and then iterating on it, right? Because the group of us here probably aren't going to get it 100% right. We can
Hmm.
hopefully get really close and then get more eyes on it
Right.
through the act of releasing something and getting people to try it and say, wait, you screwed this up. You really need regions.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We're
Just
definitely on the right path, Ben. I mean, we should just keep this up and, like you said, focus more on getting other people to try it too. So let's say we go with these three things. It's easier to add fields than to delete them. So let's just go with these three. And
to
what else do we need?
to be clear, what we're discussing here is the downward tape, or well, the information provided for S3 buckets, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Potentially Azure buckets and GCS buckets have a different set of
Oh,
values that need to be provided.
Bucket
yeah.
endpoint captures even for Azure and GCS.
No. But so this is the other important part of the conversation is that we need to have a concept of the protocol from top to bottom. From the time you create your bucket request from the bucket class, you should know what protocol you're expecting to get. And I think everywhere in the API, like if what you were expecting was S3, then we need to ensure that like you get exactly what S3 was supposed to give you. And if you were expecting to get a GCS thing, then the set of fields you get will be different, and they'll be exactly what you would expect to get from a GCS bucket. There might be a lot of overlap between them, but like you should know if you're getting a GCS thing or an S3 thing so that you can parse it accordingly.
Agree. Well, that was basically my point. So right now we are only talking about S3.
Right. For now, I'm S3. So there needs to be some higher level sort of clue to the workload that tells it whether what we're giving it is an S3 thing or GCS thing, because somebody might want to design a workload that can work with anything, right? There's no reason I couldn't have a pod that says, I don't care if it's a GCS bucket or an Azure blob or a S3 bucket. I will support all of them. Just tell me what I have. That needs to be another signal that comes down that says, this is the protocol that we're telling you about.
Yeah, so it's again discriminate union.
Well, it at the Golang struct level, but like I'm imagining that what we're presenting to the pod is some file. And so maybe it's in the file name, or maybe the file is JSON formatted and there's a field that tells you what the protocol was. This is what we need to decide is what, what does it look like? Is it a file? Does it have a well-defined name? Can the name ever change? Can you determine what the protocol is by looking at the file name, or do you have to look inside the file?
I would rather have it inside the file, because file name can, it's metadata almost at this point.
Well, like the reason I'm asking is because I remember many months ago we were talking about, wouldn't it be nice if the file that we dropped in was something that like just looked like an ordinary AWS credentials file and could be immediately consumed with no changes from an
Ideally,
app, right?
that would be good. However, there's no credentials file. There's no way to represent a bucket in a credentials file.
Okay, yeah. I just want to make sure that we touch on that again, because if we define something that's completely specific to Cozy, then everyone will need some front end adapter that consumes what we produce and converts it into the format that they want to see.
Right.
We talked about this. Krish was working on it for a while, actually. So one of the easiest ways we can do that is to have that init container that just translates a standard Cozy spec into either S3 or whatever you want it to be. So there's
Maybe.
always that possibility.
I mean, it's also possible that what we end up doing is we define the downward API in such a way that you can cause us to generate a traditional AWS creds file, and you can cause us to shove the bucket name and endpoint URL into some environment variable that gets passed on the command line to some program. And then that program can be structured such that it just reads the AWS creds file, takes the bucket name on the command line, and goes off and does its thing. And that developer's really happy, right?
Shouldn't we focus on the core of the problem now? It's like let's define what the download, because when we start talking about how we'll deliver it, then other specifics come into question. Like what if you want to have multiple buckets? Like that. So I would rather focus on like just to begin with. I understand the questions and the direction you're going. Let's first define what the download API should represent, like the core of it. Like I think it's okay.
So some intermediate data structure that gets passed down, and then how we present that might be manipulatable with your pod YAML spec. Or pod spec YAML. Okay. So yes. So at the top level, there needs to be well, okay. Here's a question: if you want to support multiple buckets, which I think we do, in principle, different buckets could have different protocols, right? You could have an S3 bucket and a GCS bucket, both vended to the same pod. So what you really need is an array of buckets, or a list of buckets, each one of which has a protocol, and then the field specific to that protocol.
Yeah. So the way distinguish between buckets is so one pod can right now we use the volumes to say this is the bucket we want. So the idea is, I finally I don't want to end up as a volume because it's not really a volume, but what we can say is, a bucket, the volume is mounted at a particular path, and inside each of the paths you get only one bucket. You don't get multiple buckets in one path.
Right.
So
Right. Okay.
we always called bucket file as bucket.json, and we have protocol specific structures in there, like protocol S3 would have the following fields, and protocol GCS would have different fields, and it's JSON, so and it looks like a proper Kubernetes spec if we did it this way.
Okay. So it's always going to be called bucket.json. You have some control over where it lands on a per bucket basis, and then inside the JSON you get a protocol, and then depending on what the protocol is, a couple of fields that are very strictly defined what you're going to get, what you can't, or the limitations on what those fields can contain and what they mean, and nothing extraneous. There's no wormhole to put opaque data in. Okay.
Now let's talk about the other concerns that are more like, again, we can almost call them meta concerns. They're like what is needed for a client to, so this is strictly information about the bucket itself. Now we need stuff that the client needs to connect to the bucket, like stuff like certificates.
Oh yeah.
So if we could essentially represent them here itself, like if you look at kubeconfig, it has the concept of a cluster. The cluster's IP address, and each one can, multiple clusters can be defined, and each one has a certificate associated with it, a PEM file, and that's just base64 encoded and put in there. We could do something like that.
I would
Well,
put that
so the reason I feel weird about certificates is because I know that developers already have to deal with this in other contexts. Like if you're interacting with some REST API from your pod,
Right.
and that REST API is hosted on a private server, like nobody helps you get the certificate. Like it's your job as the pod author to just slipstream the certificate in somehow.
Yeah, use a secret, mount the certificate as secret, and then
but in that case, you know to which service you will be talking, and hence you know what the CA cert is.
yeah,
In
we
this
do,
in
right?
the cozy case, you don't know which storage system you'll be talking to.
No,
You
that's
just
not
request
true.
a bucket.
No, that's not true. You request the bucket by a particular protocol.
No, but he's saying that, like, you wanted an S3 bucket, and you might get an actual AWS bucket on Amazon's cloud service, or you might get some NetApp provided S3 bucket running on some private NetApp server with some certificate that the admin cooked up.
The client should not. Yeah, that's true. The client should not be making decisions based on, based on this spec about which certificate to use. The certificate should just be loaded into the cert chain of the host, which will be the container in this case, and it'll just work when you make the calls.
But by the way, do we have any way of disabling SSL with the client?
Yeah, I mean, you can make the endpoint URL be HTTPS instead of HTTP instead of HTTPS.
Yeah.
In which case you get no TLS. That's always a possibility.
To me, the server set is optional, but comes next to your endpoint. It's something you need in order to connect to the storage system. And it's something that can be provided by the storage system next to the endpoint URL.
So isn't it weird to ask the driver to give back certificates? Like, because the driver itself shouldn't have to know about certificates. Certificates are more of a, it shouldn't have to be a part of the data flow of Cozy. It should just be something that's present to ensure that the communication between Cozy and communication between workload and communication between Cozy and the backend and the communication between workload and the backend are secure. That's all certificates are needed for. So
yeah, I have mixed feelings about this because I can see it from both sides. Like it can be a pain in the butt to deal with getting the certificates into the right place, but I think it's a pain that people already have to deal with pretty widely. And I'm not sure that we'd be shifting the pain onto the the driver authors to always know what certificate to send down.
Right.
And that's not an easy problem to solve on the driver side either. I mean, in some cases it will be, but in other cases it could be really
No,
hard.
the other thing is, they might have certificates integrated into some certificate management system, and we can't reliably expect, like you said, we can't expect our drivers to integrate with it because,
Yeah.
those systems will be integrated through Kubernetes.
And we're almost out of time, and I have to jump exactly at 2, but I wanted to.
I really want to continue this conversation because keep in mind, for example, the driver also needs to talk to the storage system, so likely should also be validating if it's using some API.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It's not an explicit validation. It's not doing it in code. You know what I mean?
It could be a different certificate that
Right.
it's using to talk to this
Right.
to
That
the
too.
REST endpoint than what the S3 client would be using to talk to the S3 endpoint.
But
It could be.
potentially, yes. But if you want this whole thing to make if you want pod specs, the YAML, to be portable, then we can't expect one to be forced to make changes to the pod spec to inject some certificate somehow in the running container.
No.
No.
Okay, so
Certificate injection
here's
is itself portable. That's not true. Certificate injection is itself portable. So this problem doesn't exist. What you're saying. Hey, so by the way, we're almost running out of time. But Nicholas, please finish your thought, your response to whatever I said, and then let's quickly decide where this will reside, this API. I mean, we don't have to decide. We'll talk about it, and then we'll call it, end of the meeting today. But yes, Nicholas, if you have something.
No, we should continue at some other point in time. So I have some use cases in mind for our customers, which is on premises, which is self-signed certificates everywhere, and that flow should be simple. And I'm not sure we are currently achieving that goal.
possibly not.
Yeah,
another field is proxy. Another capability.
Proxy can again be set on the host itself, but we'll get to it. I'm coming from the point of view that maybe we could have a separate file for things like this that are more like connection specific information, or maybe we could just offload to the pod. But if needed, obviously we'll add it here. That's not a problem. Yeah, we'll just understand that better in the next meeting. So for this API, I think we should have it in our central API repo, like wherever we store all the other cozy APIs. Yeah, we're almost out of time. So if you have anything to bring up or say, please do so. Otherwise, we can continue on Monday.
I have to excuse myself for Monday.
Signature version guy. Good question. Good.
I'd like to keep iterating on this part of the spec, and then once we have something we're happy with, work that backwards through the gRPC into the YAML for bucket access classes and bucket accesses, because I think it all ties together.
This is how we came up with this in the first place. Yeah, but we'll do it a little better this time. Yeah. Because
this, I think, is the part of the spec that needs the most work, and once we get this right, then I'll be really enthused to go ask Tim for his thoughts on brownfield buckets and all the other stuff.
Definitely.
But I feel like that's less important than these details.
Fair enough. I mean that part is also important, like the abstraction, but yeah, that can be changed later on, but this can't. You're right.
Yeah. This is at the core of what we're doing. The brownfield stuff is just a little bit of syntactic sugar on how you import them or create them.
So Guy, I'm going to capture your suggestions here so I don't forget it before next meeting. We don't lose it.
Sure, I'm just going over the.
You have to jump off
Thank
now.
you guys.
All right, thank you everyone.
Okay, bye.
Talk to you Monday.